Father in heaven, we thank you. Here we are with in warmth and some snacks and coffee, and we have your word as well. What a privilege it is to come and to learn your word in peace, which is nice. We don't want to ever take that for granted. We ask, Lord, that you bless this time and continue to give us the insight, and always to be ready and watching, look at our own hearts and our own life to make sure that when you come, we are ready and looking forward to it. We just pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. Who wants to read a verse? I was just thinking of a verse. Jan, you want to read a verse for us?
Yeah, sure.
Let's read 2 Timothy 4:8. As we somebody was talking. Oh, it was somebody was talking to me last night at the VBS meeting about getting a crown. Well, there's 5 different crowns in the Bible.
He's not here.
He's not here today. This is a good verse to memorize. 2 Timothy 4:8. Well, how about 7 and 8? That's good context, right? Jan, go for it.
I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing.
Yeah. So, Paul, here he is at the end. He knows he's not going to be raptured up. I think he's come to that conclusion that I'm going out. I'm going to give my life. And but he says, I want to finish strong. I fought the good fight, and I'm looking forward to the Lord's return. And he's going to get that crown. But everybody who loves the Lord's appearing, and part of loving the Lord's appearing is looking for it, right? I mean, in that sense, you got to keep your mind on it. So as we come to today, what we've been doing is looking at this Olivet Discourse. That's the last major sermon that Jesus gave from the Mount of Olives. On the top there, you can see that kind of the 3 questions that were asked. And we're going to do a few things today, because what Jesus gives in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, is when he gives some descriptions, but he'll pull some things from the book of Daniel, which we'll talk about, hopefully. And then we're going to see how some of these correlate with the book of Revelation, which had not been written yet. And so words are important, and especially prepositions, because if you harmonize all of the 3 sections, it's really challenging sometimes. But what he did. So what we learned is, right at the top, let's just review a little bit. Jesus had just said all the stones and the stones that were used to construct the temple building itself, all these things are going to be tossed around. They're going to be overthrown. And remember that they were just getting ready to go into the final week. The disciples are still thinking the kingdom's coming in all its glory. And Jesus says, nope. All this stuff, and they're freaking out, like, what? And they said, well, when will these things be? Question 1a there on the top, the destruction of Jerusalem. What sign will there be when these things, the destruction of Jerusalem, are about to happen? So they kind of asked 2 things. When, and can you give us a specific marker about Jerusalem's destruction, and specifically the temple's destruction? And what we do know is historically, there was a lot of gold in the temple itself, inside. And so when the temple, when the siege was happening, some soldier started the temple on fire, which melted the gold. And so the gold made its way in the cracks and all these other things. And so afterwards, when the fire's over, gold hardens. And if you're a Roman soldier, what do you want? So how do you get it?
Chisel.
Dig.
You have to dig. And so they took apart all the stones in order to get the gold, which Jesus' words were fulfilled exactly, literally, because they're like, well, we're not going to let any of this just be in the dirt. Okay? Question number 2 there, what shall be the sign or the marker specifically of your coming? And what are the signs, what will be the sign of the end of the age? So what we saw last time, which we're going to go a little bit more in depth on the chart, but the sign of the end of the age is going to be out here, and we discussed how the end of the age has been 2,000 years so far, and Jesus is going to describe that. Now, the first thing that he does, just again for a little review, is the general characteristics of the church. This is important because this week several people have asked me, Mano, what do you think about what's going on in Israel?
Yeah. We need to pray for Israel.
So some bombs going off, rockets. So now that you guys are all intellectually enlightened, how do you answer that? What's going on in Israel today?
They're always fighting.
Nothing to see here.
Nothing to see here.
Nothing to see here. These are just signs. These are just characteristics. Jesus says you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. I mean, if you've lived, which I haven't, but if you've lived since Jerusalem was founded, they got the 48 War, you got the Suez War, you got the Yom Kippur War in 73, you got the Lebanon War in 82. I mean, so every time some of these things happen, imagine if we don't understand this correctly, the 6-Day War in 67, you're like, oh wow, oh this could be it, let's get excited. And then it comes and goes, and then you have the Yom Kippur War in 73, oh this is it. And then it comes and goes. And so what happens is many times as Christians, we get excited because we're thinking that, hey, something's happening in Israel, this should be significant. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't in the very immediate sense. So then, but we might make a big deal of it, and then it comes and goes, and now we're in 56, and then we're in 67, and then we're in 73, and now we're in 82, and now we're in all the intifadas in the 90s, and our friends and relatives are going, aren't you burnt out? You've been so excited about anything that's happened, and in reality, if we had this understanding, we wouldn't have been too excited. We'd be like, well, this is just normal. Because they're going to look at us and say, what's significant? And we go, nothing.
But
Nothing.
Incrementally
Incrementally is different.
Incrementally, the hatred of Israel is increasing, though, which is definitely a big something.
So what we do see is, let's go to Zechariah. That's a good thing. Go to Zechariah chapter 12. That's good verses just come to mind, right? This is where there is something significant. Zechariah chapter 12. So, it says in verse 1, the oracle of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. Behold, I am about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. On that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all of the peoples, or all the nations. All who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. And so, what you do see is this, and then on that day, declares the Lord, he goes on and talks about this war. There's a war coming. And the war is here. This is like Armageddon, okay? Armageddon is unfortunately misunderstood because most of the traditional scholarship will say that Armageddon comes from a Hebrew word, Har Megiddo, which means mountain of Megiddo. Okay, it's not true. I think if you look at the etymology of the words and the linguistics of it, there is no mountain in Megiddo at all. So it comes from a different place where in reality it's speaking about what we know as the Valley of Jehoshaphat, which in Jerusalem, if the Temple Mount is here, the Mount of Olives is here, what valley goes through here? The Kidron Valley. Well, if you follow the Kidron Valley, it comes up and it curves like this, and it becomes the Jehoshaphat Valley. Well, I won't bore you with all of it, but the idea is that in this last war where the nations gather, they're gathering to make war against Israel in the Valley of Decision, it's called, in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, which is what Zechariah 12 is discussing. This final war where they come and the Antichrist comes, and you can see that in Revelation 12. But what is significant, as Bob mentioned, is the incremental hatred of Israel. So that on that day, Jerusalem already is becoming a burdensome stone for all nations. We've seen that going all the way back. And the main reason why is because of this discrepancy or warfare, the thorn in the side, if you want to say, of the Palestinian cause, if you want to say it that way. So, you know, they claim Jerusalem as their capital, at least East Jerusalem. Israel says, no way, it's never going to be divided. So in one sense, what we're seeing isn't significant. It's significant in Zechariah 12 in the incremental nature that Jerusalem is continually becoming this hot point, this sore point of trouble. That's why the Pope's he gets involved, and he's like, well, we need to make Jerusalem an international city for all three Abrahamic faiths, you know, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. And so all these people have their opinions. And you think, I mean, really, why would anybody truly care about Jerusalem? If you take religion out of it, would anybody care about Jerusalem? They wouldn't. It has no natural economic value of any kind. It's kind of a small place. It's a little bit. It's in the inward side, or the inside of on the mountains of Israel. There's no port there, so the only thing that makes it significant is this idea of religion. Now, go back 200 years ago. Did the world make a big deal out of Jerusalem? No, it didn't. So that's where we see this fighting going on. It's significant only in the sense of it fulfills some of the imagery of Zechariah 12. But in the sense of these local skirmishes, don't get excited. I will say that one of the things that would get me excited, not so much excited for a war, but a little bit more, maybe not word excited is, well, just like, it's excited, like, oh wow, this is scripture. Enthusiastic about is if Iran and Russia started getting involved. Now we have the Gog and the Magog war of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And we've seen, you got pictures of Putin, Iran, as well as Erdogan of Turkey standing together. Those three are the yahoos of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And so you already see some of that, that's the alliances coming together. And they're going to turn at some point to come against Israel. But so until that happens, nothing to see. Okay?
They just met with the addition of China. Those countries just met like within the last 45 days.
It's interesting. In Revelation, it talks about the kings of the East making ways for the kings of the East, which I think is China. And but we're not there yet. That's during the tribulation. So, okay.
What verse was that?
Verse 2 and 3. So, let's go back. So, general characteristics of the church age. You can see there I have it underlined. Jesus says you're going to hear of local skirmishes, wars, rumors of wars, false messiahs, false religion. Don't get excited. All these things just are going to happen. The end is not going to come immediately. So all those things under the general characteristics are non-signs. So then he goes into question 3. He answers, what will be the sign of the end of the age? We talked about that. That there's going to be world wars, earthquakes, famines, COVID, right? Okay. There's going to be all these things, fearful sights in the heavens, great signs. He says, these are all the beginnings of sorrows, or the beginnings of travail or birth pains. So what we see is as the end of the age gets continually more fulfilled, we've seen world wars now from 1914 on, and we've seen an increase in all these other things. You think about, go back to, imagine if we were living in 1918, okay? What's significant about living in 1918 and reading this particular passage? First World War just finished, right? 1914, 1917. What else do we have now?
Spanish flu.
The Spanish flu? Man, People must have been really excited.
Yeah.
And that's why there's a lot of prophecies, or so-called, like Watchtower, Jehovah's Witnesses.
But Israel wasn't a nation.
Israel wasn't a nation, so you're like, well, we're excited, but yet, how can the end come?
Yeah, there wasn't an influx in technology.
There wasn't a technology. We'll see that in a little bit.
The Ottoman Empire is being dismantled.
The Ottoman Empire was dismantled because going from the 1400s to 1917, that's when like they got out the map. The French and the English started drawing lines and said, oh, let's make Iraq, let's create Iran, let's create the country of Jordan. And then really Israel was just Jordan. They called Transjordan and Cisjordan along the Jordan River. So that was just Jordan. And then you know Egypt was there, and then Syria, they just created it out of nowhere. Lebanon. So all those were part of the Ottoman Empire. And so you do see some of these world empires just dissolving in that regard. So what we do know is that all of these signs of the end of the age, earthquakes, famines, pestilences, the idea of COVID as an example, this was just round one, okay? It's coming again, you know, and you see the fear mongering that began, and it's going to continue all the way through. And what we see is when you look at the four horsemen of Revelation 6, one of the horsemen is pestilence. So it's going to be far, far worse. And to be able to manipulate the fear is going to lead right up into the mark of the beast. So we're seeing some of this stuff, and the fact that it's become worldwide, pandemic is just a word. It's going to be in our vocabulary now. It's going to be in our experience from now until the rapture, and even until the Lord returns. That's just, and Jesus mentions it here, and we go. So people ask, you go, hey, that's exactly what Jesus said would happen. And it helps. What does it tell us? Well, we're getting closer and closer to the end of the age. I mean, it began, and every day that proceeds is closer and closer to what we see. But he says all these are the beginning, okay? Not the end. That's important. All these show us that the end of the age is beginning, and it takes a period of time. Okay. Then what Jesus does is the next section there, personal experiences of the apostles. This is important because if you take all of these, again, the harmony of these 3 chapters, or 4 chapters, there's a lot of similarities. But we're looking for key words to say, well, what is the timing of this versus the timing of this? But I have there underlined, but before all these things, what things? Before all of the end of the age signs, something's going to happen. So he says, okay, I've talked to you about the end of the age, but before all those, let me tell you what's going to happen to you guys, you 12, or really in this sense, the disciples of Jesus' immediate vicinity. You know, you could say all of them minus Judas plus the other disciples. He says, before all these things, that's a key word, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues. That's important too. So underline synagogues. What does synagogues tell us?
Church.
Temples.
Well, it's all over the Jewish, like synagogues in different towns.
Yes? What's the ethnic importance of a synagogue? Jewish. This is telling us this has a Jewish context. Later, we're going to see there's no mention necessarily of the synagogues. You'll see it in the events of the first half of the tribulation. He doesn't mention synagogues there. That one is in reference to all nations. He doesn't mention all nations here. Again, words are very important in understanding what Jesus is saying and its limited context. So he says who he's talking to. Because remember, it's really, really hard in the Bible. When Jesus says, I tell you the truth, you must be born again. Who's he talking to? Nicodemus. I guess is Nicodemus the only one that ever needs to be born again? See how we do that? We go, well, hey, contextually, he's only talking to Nicodemus. But we go, yes. But contextually, with the rest of the Bible, we understand that the you there is broader than just the you he's talking to. So we're not being inconsistent because we have to understand who is the you. Many times it's plural, sometimes it's singular. Is there other indicators that he's talking to a broader audience or a specific audience? So we just have to understand language, hermeneutical methodology.
Let's use the South, y'all.
Y'all! So here he's talking, before all these things, they will lay their hands on you. And I think he's talking to the disciples specifically because he says, before all these signs, let's talk about you. Where later he says, if you just go down 2 sections really quick, what's the first word of the events of the first half of tribulation? Then. Then is after these signs, there's going to be something happening in this period. That's the then, this is before. Okay, so we'll get there, but I just want to show you the importance of these time markers. Okay, but before, they're going to lay their hands and persecute you, delivering you up to synagogues and prisons. Definitely a Jewish context. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. Did that happen?
Yes.
Who? Give me an example. Paul, for sure. But Paul's not standing there listening to this.
King Agrippa.
Peter and John.
Yeah, at least, so I'm saying that he's talking to that. We don't want to just limit it to the 12. He's talking to that generation, that group, that will include all of the early disciples, about being brought to synagogues, which would include Paul later. Paul gets saved probably about, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years later. Maybe not 10, that would be too. Anyways, 5 to 10 roughly. And so it includes these things. King Agrippa, there's no doubt, King Herod, Herod Agrippa in Acts chapter 12, who killed James, and then also, which is John's brother James, who heard this. I mean, James fulfilled this. James is one of the ones hearing this on the Mount of Olives. Peter, James, John, and Andrew. He says, hey, you're brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, but it will turn out for you as an occasion for a testimony. Therefore, settle in it in your hearts, not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. What does that immediately remind you of? Early book of Acts. Remember Acts chapter 7, Stephen?
Yeah.
It says they couldn't resist the words. His words were like an angel. And so he gives this whole history of Israel in Acts chapter 7 from the beginning all the way through, and he reminds them of their stiff-neckedness. You were stiff-necked here, you were stiff-necked here. It's no surprise that you're stiff-necked now. They get mad, they stone him, and they kill him. And so here, we don't know where Stephen was at as it relates to one of the disciples, or we have the apostles, but some of the disciples, because we know Jesus dies, he's resurrected, he ascends, and in Acts chapter 2, how many are there in the upper room? 120.
120, that's right.
That's a lot of people. So was Stephen one of them? Probably. So, and remember, Jesus just had said this 50 days ago, right? Because Pentecost is 50 days after, Passover. So Jesus gets, he ascends, 3rd day later, or resurrects, and then he's there for 40 days, and then he leaves. So this is all fresh. And then we see in Acts chapter 7, Stephen, again, could be, it's hard the timing, but maybe a couple years later gets killed.
Acts chapter 4, too, about the sovereignty of God. How God planned, their testimony from Peter.
Oh, yeah.
How he planned everything. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Good timing, good answer.
Yep. Pray for boldness, Lord. What you predestined, your hand has predestined to happen, to kill Jesus. And then in Acts chapter 5, remember we said, be careful if you pray for boldness, because the next week you might get beat up. And that's what happened, and they counted themselves worthy.
Or if you pray for patience.
Pray for patience. Be careful about that.
Yeah.
Don't ask God for a blank check. He might move you out of the greatest place on earth. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
So he says, you will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. but not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your endurance possesses your souls. Now, so here, it's interesting that on the bottom one, on 2 down, events of the first half, he brings up persecution again in a different context. But you can see there in the first line, you will be hated by what? All nations. Notice he doesn't say up here, he said you'll just be hated by all. Nations is left out of this first one, but nations appears twice in the Matthew 24 section after the beginning of birth pains. So what you see there is the personal experiences of the apostles. So we have 2 things here. I interrupt me anytime, because, you know, this is like, but I mean it's like 2 + 2 for me. But I understand it might be new, and so I don't want you to be like, okay, I don't get it. Angela says that, so she goes, no, I come to class, but most of it goes over my head. I go, man, you have an opportunity every night to ask me, what do you mean? And she does it. So we have this idea of the nations, okay, which is very international, worldwide. And then over here, sorry about that, but if we have this idea of the synagogues, okay? So this tells us that persecution is very localized here, at least what he's describing. Versus the pure persecution that he talks later, very similar. People are going to hate you. I mean, how many different ways can you say people are going to hate you? Okay, they're going to hate you, and you're going to be betrayed. So we have this persecution, and then we have this persecution during the tribulation period. Okay, so that's why we're looking at these words and we're going, oh, this is how we dissect this. Otherwise, it becomes confusing. Yeah, sorry, this is synagogues. Yeah, but it tells us it's a Jewish context, okay? So, a couple things here. He said, hey guys, they're going to kill you. They're going to put some of you to death. You're going to be hated, but not a hair of your head shall be lost. Now, this is kind of a parallel passage, not in the sense of timing, but what you do see in the Gospels is Jesus said a lot of things over and over, right? He didn't just say it once. He would say things over and over. He had certain principles, he had certain teachings that were said here, and later he'd give more information. Well, this same verbiage, same teaching, appears in Matthew chapter 10. Let's go there for a second. So this was said earlier, but he brings up these general principles of what it means to be a Christian. Let's see. Matthew chapter 10, we'll go to the end. We'll start in verse 16. He's getting ready here. He's talking to them about, if you look at the first part, verse 5, he sends the 12 out. Hey guys, I'm giving you power over unclean spirits. I'm giving you powers to heal the sick, raise the dead. He's training these 12 to go out and preach the gospel. And he sends them out on their own, 2 by 2. Okay? That's 5 all the way through verse 15. But then in 16 he says, behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and also the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and the children will rise up against their parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end. So, he says here, remember, similar context. Now, here he's sending them out. In Luke chapter 10, you see him sending out the 70. And then you see them coming back and they're all excited. But this idea of persecution and being brought before kings did not happen in Jesus' 3.5 years. He's telling them, I'm sending you out now, and later you're going to be persecuted, and they're probably going, huh? Because they had no concept that Jesus was going to be killed, and you have this, as he says up here, the kingdom will not come immediately. But he's giving them these hints that later they remembered, oh, Jesus did say that in the same way that we're going out preaching the gospel, raising the sick in his ministry, in like I would say maybe the 2/3 part of his ministry, they weren't received, just like Jesus wasn't received as well. So they got a little bit of the taste of this resistance. It wasn't until later that they were killed and that they were flogged. There's no evidence anywhere in Jesus' 3.5 years when he sent them out did they get flogged. None. So clearly this is a interpretation of a hint of what's going to happen later during that period of, let's say, Jesus' resurrection from 32 AD to 70 AD. That generation, that time. So he goes on later, don't fear God. He says, fear God, don't fear man. But he says that same phrase, but not a hair of your head shall be lost. And he says there in that 10, let's go down to 28. He says, verse 29, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. What in the world is he talking about? Why does he ask the question, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny?
Is that the price at the temple for?
Yeah.
So
Just relative value.
Meaning what?
Sparrows are
Dime a dozen.
dime a dozen.
Dime a dozen.
So they have-
We have that phrase. Sparrows are a dime a dozen, which means what?
Cheap.
Cheap.
They're everywhere.
No, worthless, really, in what sense? Very, 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 very little value. He says, then the next question, and he kind of goes on, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. What is that teaching us here? Super powerful verse.
sovereign, he knows it. He knows everything.
Not just knows. God,
Like he's
Okay.
Has them in his hand.
this is sovereignty, man.
Yep.
This is the idea that if you're driving along, have you ever hit a bird while you're driving?
Yes.
Deer.
A bird, well, a deer is pretty significant, but let's talk about a bird. Dime a dozen.
Yeah.
Well, I've done that a few times, and I always go, oh, Matthew 10:29. 10:29. It's God's will. This is God's will. It says, not a bird falls from the ground apart from the Father. This is where we look at, in Proverbs 16:33's example, when you throw the dice and it comes up, he says, hey, even the outcome of the dice being thrown, God is playing some part in it. We're not saying that God took the bird and threw it into my front bumper, okay? But what we do know is that
The bug,
Yeah.
and Jonah was ready to kill himself over it, right? So.
Yeah, his behavior is that manifest
Yeah.
sometimes, yeah, just
Yeah.
over inanimate.
But it's about control. And the sovereignty of God, I think in humanity, we do not want to relinquish that. It's that sin nature all the
Yeah.
way down to our core.
it's interesting too that we, in thinking about the sovereignty of God, we don't mind when God is passively watching. Because we again, what's our heart? We don't want to accuse God of creating wrong or creating evil, but it's more than just simply observing. Jesus is saying God is actively even being passive here. And he's also actively intervening at times. But when he doesn't choose to intervene, hey,
We question him.
that would bother me. Because so oftentimes we'd say, so let's turn it around for the sake of just illustration. Bob's beating up Jackie, and we're watching it. And then afterwards, Jackie, Bob storms out, and there she is. And she turns around to all of us and says,
What the heck?
you guys could have done something and you didn't? Would she have a right to be humanly angry?
Yes. Oh, right.
Isn't that how we treat God?
Yeah.
But what if we said, I'm sorry, Jackie, that was Bob's free will. I can't interfere in Bob's free will. Would she accept that? That's a pitiful excuse.
Because we're also human.
But we put God in that category. We go, well, God couldn't intervene because God doesn't violate people's free will. So all the evil that's happening is based on man's free will. See, it puts God, it just shrinks him down. When in fact we look and we go, no, God could intervene. But he chooses not to for some reason, which we don't know why. And we get mad, and that's usually we question. She would question our goodness. She would question our.
She does that anyway.
Pardon? Maybe, yeah. What Jesus is saying here is, hey guys, if let's do the two opposite extremes. We have sparrows that are hardly worth anything. We have hares that are hardly worth anything.
To you.
But he says, not even a hair of your head being lost happens apart from God's sovereign direction. Well, if one of the least things that we could lose would be our hair, what's one of the greatest things we would lose? Our life.
Yeah.
He's making an argument here to say, hey, you're going to be persecuted. Some of you are going to die, and some of you are going to lose your life. Don't question God's sovereignty. Don't question whether God cares. God could have intervened. Could he have not?
Yes.
And he chose not to. And he says, but you guys are much more valuable than sparrows. So therefore, if God allows your hair to fall out and the very numbers are determined, if he allows a sparrow to fall to the ground or causes a sparrow to fall to the ground, however, we don't know how he's all working. Therefore, when you lose your life, don't doubt. That's what he's saying here.
Stand firm.
By your endurance, by your long-suffering endurance, it's suffering long, he says, you're going to gain your very soul, your very life.
Finish to the end.
Yep. The one who endures to the end, what? Will be saved.
Perseverance.
We see that. He's going to say that in verse 10 of Matthew 24. So we see this imagery. But Jesus is speaking about this theology. Again, not a sparrow falls. I'm telling you, I hit a bird, Matthew 29 comes out of my mouth like, okay, Lord, maybe it did break my front light. Well, yeah, God had a reason.
I think of that one, I can't remember the verses, but it's when they're talking about Jesus, not when he was reviled, he didn't revile in return, but he kept entrusting himself to the one who judges rightly.
Yep.
And I just think of that all the time when there's things I don't understand that look really bad and really hard. I can keep on continually entrusting myself and everybody else to the one who makes those righteous choices. But I love that verse because that's the one that comes to mind when things don't make sense to me.
Yep.
You know?
And also, don't shrink back.
Yeah, don't shrink back, Hebrews,
back.
right? God doesn't
Do
sleep.
any of this.
He never has his eyes off of us. And so for the disciples, especially here, their personal experience, he's giving them, you're going to be hated by all, you're going to be betrayed by your parents, relatives, friends, they're going to put you to death. Now the hair of your head shall be lost. And you go, let's unpack that one for a minute. Not a hair of your head shall be lost. This is a little bit different phrasing. And we would say, what do you mean, not a hair of my head shall be lost? I lost my life.
But it's not lost.
But is it lost?
No.
Jesus saying, just like in Revelation 2:10, hey, some of you are going to be put into tribulation for 10 days. This is my encouragement. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. You mean I'm not going to get out? You're going to give it all. Your job's just to be faithful, but be faithful to endure. And now, when we think about that, all we need to say is, well, man, I can't even conceive of that today. And Jesus says, don't worry about it today. The grace will be there the day when you get put into the lion's den, or you get put in the Roman arena, or whatever. The grace will be sufficient for you then. Don't worry about it now. Today has enough trouble. So this is super important as we see here. He's giving them. He's already told them in Matthew 10, you guys are going to have some trouble. He reiterates to them now when he's up on Mount of Olives, hey guys, these are going to be some of the challenges that are going to come to you. Okay. Then he goes, let's go on to the next section. But, okay, now he's going to answer question number 1. What about the stones of the temple getting overthrown? But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that is when you see. Now he's telling you, okay, going way back over here, is this is the sign. Okay? You guys asked for the sign? When will these things be? Question 1b. What sign will there be? Top of the page. When the destruction is about to take place. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. That's what you look for. Now, if we fast forward, Jesus is saying this in roughly 32 AD. You fast forward to 66 AD. Life's going on. I mean, man, Jesus has been gone for a while. The gospel's been preached. All different places. Paul's out. I mean, he's preaching. The gospel's going to really the whole known world at the time. At this time, 66 AD, Paul probably was already dead. Paul died roughly 64, 66. So did Peter. But they had these words. So there's believers in Jerusalem. All of a sudden, 66 AD, Roman general comes and there's a revolt that takes place by the Jews, the secular Jews or the non-Christian Jews. All of a sudden, boom, there's a garrison in Caesarea along the coast. The Roman general comes over there, surrounds and sieges Jerusalem. First time that you have a siege of Jerusalem in, who knows, in their modern history, okay? All of a sudden, what are they thinking? What is a Christian, a Messianic Jew thinking?
Get out of Jerusalem.
This is what Jesus said. Oh, he said, when you see it surrounded, know that its destruction is near. They're going, now how long is near?
What we just read said that Jerusalem was going to be become a stone, an unmovable stone.
He's speaking figuratively there in Zechariah 12 about a burdensome stone that people try to lift.
This is what's coming, right?
Zechariah 12 is different context. He's speaking about the end.
So this isn't about
This isn't Zechariah. This is about the end of Jerusalem, not the end of time. Because Zechariah 12 is about really this period here. Because he says on that day there's going to be war. He's talking about a different war. And we know that because of the context going into chapter 13 and 14 of Zechariah.
This is about AD 70 then.
This is about AD 70. So, but 66 to AD 70 is 4 years. So what happens is, Bob said right, we're trapped. Jesus said Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, but we're trapped. Well, God's very gracious. What happened was, revolt happens, army surrounded, the general realizes, I don't have enough supply lines to keep this siege going. So he lifts the siege. And he heads back to Caesarea. Well, on his way back, he gets killed. The general. He gets ambushed by some Jewish zealot. Which lifted the siege for a short period of time. And when you kill a general, what do the other generals do in the Roman army?
Get mad.
They get mad. They're going, oh no, you don't do that to us. So then they send Vespasian and his son Titus, which are in motion. They're going to replace it, and they're going to come back and siege it again. But you have a period of time when the siege is lifted. All those people that read Jesus' words, they left wisely. They were trapped, they left, they went over across the Jordan River into what we call modern-day Jordan, to a city called Pella, which is a Greek city, and they established a messianic presence there. We have that historically. And so all the Jews, the believing Jews that believed in Jesus as the Messiah, who believed his words, they left and they were saved by heading over. They're like, let's get a little farther away than just, let's get on the other side of the river so that we can say we're not part of this revolt. So they do. And according to history, there's no record of any messianic believers, Jewish believers in Jesus dying because they listened to his words. 1.1 million Jews, when they came back, Vespasian and Titus came back, AD 70, they annihilated everybody in the town. Over 1 million Jews killed. Just like Jesus said. And so you have this, what Jesus saying, when you see it surrounded, its desolation is near. Then, okay, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. So we're still talking about Jerusalem. If you see this, you need to get out of town. Well, we can't because we're trapped. They're praying. Oh, the siege is lifted. God answered the prayer. And they leave. They follow his words. He says, for these are the days of vengeance, and all things which are written may be filled about this. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. The distress is not upon the world. Okay? This is in the land. This is specifically in reference to Jerusalem and Judea. We just have the context. This is different than this distress. In Revelation 3:10, Jesus says to that church, because you have kept my commands to persevere and to endure, I'm going to keep you from the hour of trial that will come upon the whole earth to test those who dwell on the earth. So, again, different context, right? One is this worldwide trouble and distress over all nations. But here he's talking about this distress that's going to happen in the land of Israel, specifically Jerusalem and Judea. It's isolated here. Okay? He says, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. Okay? And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So, Jerusalem, okay, so they disperse the Jews in the land of, or in the city of Jerusalem. And the Rome was like, okay, we annihilated you as any sort of, the temple's gone, so now there's no base or centrality of government anymore. Remember, before the temple, the Sadducees were the main, the priests, the aristocrats, Pharisees, all of them worked together. They had a government. They had a religious center. They had everything they needed in Jerusalem. Once that was gone, boom, they were scattered out of Jerusalem. So what they did is there's a city called Yamnia along the coast of Israel. So the Pharisees, this is important too, in just in thinking about Jewish history. The Sadducees were the main aristocratic priests. They were very liberal in their theology. They only believed in the 5 books of Moses. They were, a lot of them sold out to Rome. They were very friendly with Rome, where the Pharisees were not. The Pharisees were a little bit more strict. Okay? Well, if you go in there and you destroy all the temple, and you kill all the priests, then who's left? Pretty much the Pharisees are only, because the Pharisees, they had a presence as scribes and teachers amongst in all of the land of Israel, especially in the synagogues. So when you get rid of the Sadducees and their particular group, we know from Josephus that you had the Sadducees, you had the Essenes, and you had the Pharisees, and you also had the Zealots. Well, you kind of get rid of the Zealots in some regard too. So then, religiously, all you have left is the Pharisees, which became the rabbis of what you see of the Middle Ages. That's where, when we think of rabbinic theology or what the rabbis teach, especially in the Talmud, which is their big, huge commentary on what's known as the Mishnah or the oral law. We have the written law and the oral law. It's very, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, all we pretty much had is, well, what were the Jews like when Jesus was around? Well, we have a little bit of the Gospels, but then you have this whole body of doctrine of the Pharisees, which are the rabbis. And people are like, oh, okay. But once the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, everybody's like, boy, it was much more diverse than what we knew from history. Because now we have all these other writings. And you're like, oh, these guys didn't get along. And in fact, the Pharisees were kind of a minority power broker versus the Sadducees. Why? Because the Sadducees were the priests and really had control of the temple. And when you have control of the temple, you have control of everything else. So, in that regard, you see all these different branches, and then after 70 AD, all you kind of have is the Pharisees and the rabbinic theology, if you look at it in a religious sense.
So the powers were diminished.
The power was very diminished. And then in 132, they decided to have another revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt. A guy by the name of Rabbi Akiva declares Simon Bar Kokhba, which means Simon, son of the star. What does that remind you of? Well, Numbers 24, a star shall come out of Jacob, in referring to Jesus. It's a messianic prophecy. So they called him Simon the Star Man. He's the Messiah. So they go, they revolt, they make coins, and Rome said, and it lasted 3 years. That's a long time.
Yeah.
Rome comes down and says, enough's enough, wipes out all of the Jews. If a Jew even steps foot in Jerusalem, death. And then they built a temple on the mount, the Temple Mount, there to Jupiter. They renamed the town. It's not called Jerusalem anymore. It's called Aelia Capitolina. And they eliminated all Jewish presence. And like Jesus says, they were led captive into all nations. Not only in 70 AD, but by 135. And he says, they eliminated them as a nation until 1948. So you got this whole historical period. Jesus was correct. Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles fulfilled. When you look at times of the Gentiles, that began in 70 AD, and it's primarily a reference to Jerusalem. Even to this day, as we saw in the last week, who controls Jerusalem?
Gentiles.
The Gentiles still do, especially the Temple Mount. The Jordanian, it's hard to say in English, but it's the Waqif. Those are the letters, the consonants. They control the Temple Mount. Even though Israel, they could go in there and just wipe them all out, destroy the Dome of the Rock. They haven't done that, but it's still controlled and trampled by the Gentiles. The Al Askamas, the Dome of the Rock, those are all Gentiles. So when you see that, Jesus is saying that's going to happen until the time of the Gentiles is ended, which is going to be at the second coming. When Jesus comes in, cleans it all up, creates a new temple, the Ezekiel 40 through 48 temple, and redoes all that. So they're still living in the times of the Gentiles. This is different theologically than Romans 11, where Paul is describing the fullness of the Gentiles. Two different theologies there. The fullness of the Gentiles is Gentiles coming in and being part of the church, salvation.
Jews to this day are very secular, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Zionists aren't necessarily religious or faithful.
Oh, no.
Faithful following. So would if a Zionist is in control of Jerusalem, would that be considered a Gentile? You know, I mean, if the political movers and shakers of the Israelis is in control, would that be a Gentile presence still, or would you?
I think that until the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque is removed from God's holy site, you're going to have Gentile trampling there.
Okay.
Because even I will say this.
So the tourists.
Well, fair enough. Historically, when Theodor Herzl, back in the 1890s, he was a secular Jew. He's the one that really created Zionism. And he didn't care. He said, oh, go to, not Mongolia, but Uganda. He suggested that we set up a homeland for the Jews in Uganda. He didn't care where it was. How do I care about the Bible? The Bible, Jerusalem. All we know is the Jews need a place to have their own.
What time period was this?
This was in the 1890s. So that kind of established the beginning. But as it developed, God in His sovereignty brought him back, and the Jews started coming back to the land of Israel in droves. They always had a very minority presence there, but they started coming back. They started buying the land, because even when Mark Twain went there, he's like, man, this is like a cursed land. Who would want to live here? He's talking about the land of Israel. Nobody did. God had allowed it to become a dry, dusty desert. Now, you go look on the satellite map today, what do you see? Green. Okay, a lot. It's lush. So the only reason that you would long to go back to this desert, why would you want to go there?
History.
As your heritage. Yeah. You're going, well, this is the land, those people that were believers, they said, who are believers in the sense of God, their heritage. They go, well, this is the land that God gave us. So they went back, they started all the kibbutz movements and the Mossad movements. You know, they were like, hey, this is our land. This is God gave it to us. So they started doing all these things, and all of a sudden, as you watch the history, it came to a climax really in the late 1930s. Britain was in control of this. Like, remember, it got carved up after World War I. So the British were in control of this, and all of a sudden the Jews who were living in the land started terrorizing, or terrorists. You want to know who the first terrorists in the land of Israel? What was the Jews? They were bombing British soldiers. So kind of what comes around goes around. You got to be careful with that, right? What you reap is what you sow. So they were doing all this. Finally, the Brits said, we had enough, and all the things came to become a nation. But all of that history there was the Jews coming back in the land. But now what you've seen is a shift. The religious Jews at the time said, this is an absolutely abomination to have a nation. Because why? You look at David Ben-Gurion, who was the first president. All these guys were basically communist socialists. They weren't capitalists by any means. They had agreements with the Soviet Union after World War II. And so, if you were a religious Jew, you looked at this secular country and thought of it as an abomination. And in fact, some of them fought against the secular people at establishing it, because why? For them, no, the only way that Israel will become a nation again is if the Messiah comes back and does it. But now what you've seen over the last 15, 20 years is the official rabbinic position is Israel is an abomination. But some of them are going, well, hey, in God's sovereignty, He's brought the nation back, and He's given us the opportunity, so they start preparing for the temple and these other things, and so they're coming in now, and they have a different view. Many of them have rejected the typical rabbinic view to say, only the Messiah. We need to prepare it for the Messiah. So you've seen a shift in the thinking, which is why they're preparing to build a temple, because they know that if they can do that, then the Messiah will come. That's their ideas. So it's shifted a little.
This is on track to some degree, but the English general, World War I, Allenby. Remember, he flew over and dropped the leaflets, and it fulfills a specific passage in regards to the fact that Jerusalem, no bombs ever were dropped on it in World War I. You know the passage or no? I'll have to look it up next week. Okay, I'll look it up next week. But basically, it talks about it falls in a day peacefully. There wasn't battles in the street. He sent a plane over and said, hey, we're going to destroy this. And the Ottoman Empire just fled. They just gave up.
There definitely are bullet marks on the walls of the old city. But in the sense of bombs, there wasn't necessarily any of that. But
he took it just by, whatever, dropping leaflets. Because he was a man of faith, and he couldn't believe he was going to siege, go into Jerusalem. I'll look that up.
Because the old city's still there, and now if you cross over to Jordan, it's called the Allenby Bridge. So they named a bridge after him because of that. But so I guess we can kind of end here in the sense of Jesus' comments about the signs of the destruction of Jerusalem. And let's try to think of a couple of things I wanted to do here. So let's, any comments, questions? If we get into the next one, it really is going to be challenging to get into the next section.
Events.
Yeah, the events of the first half of the tribulation, because I guess we'll say it this way. The first word there in the next section is then. Then is after the events of the 70 AD, as well as the events of the sign of the end of the age. Because if we were to read, go up to question number 3. If you see there, it says, see where it says Matthew 24, 7 and 8?
Yeah.
See that on the bottom of question 3 answered that section? If we were to go, well, okay, that's 7 and 8. The events of the first half are verse 9 through 14. So, even though what I've done is I've inserted the Luke 21 section, but it makes it seem odd. But if let's look it up in your Bible for a minute. Matthew 24. This will be a good closer here. Because we've inserted the Luke section in the middle, which is contextual. But if we were to just read what Matthew says here, he's answering the question. Jesus is saying, let me tell you in verse 8, Matthew 24:8, all these, nation against nation, kingdom, famines, are the beginning of the birth pains. Then, okay, well, what do we know? Let me do this. I can do this for the sense of scale. All right, let's do this. So here we go. This is going now. There's the cross. This is 2021, and then let's say this is 1914. Okay. So this is the tribulation starts. Okay. So Jesus says, hey, these are the famines, earthquakes, wars, pestilences. These are the birth pains. Right? These are the beginning of those. This is the sign of the end of the age. So the end of the age is here, but you have this whole sequence of events from really 1914 on. He says, okay, then, which is after this, what does he say? Then they're going to deliver you up to tribulation, kill you, and be hated by all nations. See again, so now you have this tribulation period. This is where we get the idea of tribulation, specifically. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation. We call this the 7-year tribulation. And then we know, if we come here, this, according to, well, 24, 15, and 16, this is the Great Tribulation. And Daniel 12, 1 through 11. Okay? After the birth pains, when you start seeing those, then after that there's going to come a period when you're going to be persecuted. Who's the you?
All believers. Those that are left.
Those that are left. Believers. It's broader than just the Jews. Why? Because all nations. Remember? What he doesn't say here is synagogues, which would make it Jewish. We have the Jewish synagogue, Jewish persecution here, with the synagogues, blah, 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 in this period. And if we say this is 70 AD, okay, this clearly, the then is pointing to after. And what we had in the discussion, we have the discussion here of Luke, which was really talking about this. You see how confusing this can be? Yeah, the then and the before. Before all these things, okay, let's make sure we point that way. Then you're going to have persecution. You're going to be persecuted by all nations. Makes it worldwide at this time. Again, words are very important.
Earlier you said that the then in this events of the first half. So it's the first 3.5 years.
Correct.
Yeah.
So see where it says events of the first half? That's this 3.5 years.
Right. Right.
And all these things he describes here, persecutions, killing, this is going to happen starting in the first half of the tribulation period.
Okay.
And we know why. Well, when you get to Revelation 7, there's multitudes standing up in heaven. And we'll talk about that next time. We'll correlate it. And one of the elders says, hey, who are these people? And they respond, these are the ones that are coming out of the Great Tribulation. The only way that you come out of the Great Tribulation and get in heaven is how? Death. Yeah, these are the ones coming out because they're in heaven. He sees this great multitude of people in heaven. Oh, great! Now, this isn't the rapture. They're coming out through death. And we'll see that in a minute. Versus,
Get the white robes ready.
if we look here, you have the rapture sometime before, which these people are being received unto Jesus himself. They're in heaven, and they escaped death. That's according to the pre-trib. So, the reason we have to cover Matthew 24 you know, in this section, is because it has so much to do with Revelation 6 through 18. So, and we'll get into a little bit of Daniel 9 next week and Daniel 12.
Okay, so, just quick, so believers go in the rapture. Then more believers start after the 3.5 years.
Yeah, so let's answer that really quick. We got 1 minute here.
Okay.
Okay.
But they're different believers than the rapture.
So, the rapture happens here at that moment. We don't know how long it is between the start of the tribulation. We don't know. 1 day, 1 hour, 1 year, 5 years? I don't know. I tend to think it would be relatively close because God doesn't leave the world without a witness. That's just God's nature. Okay. Let's say it happens 1 hour before the tribulation begins. Okay. For 1 hour, no believers on earth. Not a single true believer, follower of Jesus Christ. Because all of them are taken. All the Peter's raised from the dead, the resurrection happens. Jesus comes back, receives us unto himself. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We get up. Jesus says, where I am, I want you to be with me. I want you to see me in my glory. Woo, we get a tour of heaven. Okay? Just like who are dead, they're up there now.
Doesn't the central text of Judaism written by Rabbi Judah back in 200 CE kind of lay everything out by year when it was supposed to happen?
Well, we're talking about we're talking about someone who is not a follower of Jesus. And so,
True.
So they're not true prophets or true believers, and so whatever they've set up has not come to be. Because remember, they're not waiting for Jesus. They have their ideas of what the Messiah should be. And they have some interesting things based on the Old Testament. We're not opposed to that. But they talk about wars and rumors of wars and nation against nation. So for them, if you went to a rabbinic Jew today, they'd say, oh yeah, we're totally in the Messianic age, in the sense of the arrival of the Messiah. Why? Well, because you have world war. You have nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. These are the footsteps of the Messiah. For them, it's the first coming. We go, yeah, you're right, but it's his second return, or it's the second time he's coming around. So that's how I would answer that. So,
Okay, so we got that little bit of time.
we got this little bit of time.
About an hour.
And
Okay.
then,
What happens after this, God immediately, according to Revelation 7, saves 144,000 Jews. We'll get there.
okay,
Revelation 7, 12,000 from each tribe.
okay.
And then immediately what you have in that vision of Revelation 7 is these Jews that are saved, they're out evangelizing, and now you have this big group of people that are saved. So a whole bunch of people get saved starting immediately after the 144.
Will there be Gentiles too, or is all?
Oh yeah, no, all Gentiles, from every tribe, tongue,
All
nation,
nations.
people. That's the image that you see in Revelation 7. So there's going to be a lot, these are called the tribulation saints. The only way some of them will survive, but not very many. Most will die, and they're in heaven. And they're given the road.
Just to connect the dot in regards to the woke movement, they look at that, at Revelation 7 about every nation, every tongue, and so on and so forth. And there's a motivation for the modern church in many different parts of Western culture that we have to have that imagery right now.
Oh yeah.
That's where this woke movement is like, they're very passionate about trying to have every church be multicultural because they feel that they think they have to fulfill that. But if it's after the rapture, it's the tribulation
It's
church
the tribulation, yeah.
that would become instantly multicultural because everybody will see quite clearly that what was said was true. So they're going to have a lot better chance to be multicultural than us, since we're in a fairly white community right here. So what do?
I would even go a step further to say that Revelation 7 has nothing to do with what is happening on earth in the sense of a multicultural church. I understand what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing with you. Just that what you see is a vision of these people in heaven. So naturally, on earth they could still have the Korean church and the Chinese church. They could still be separate. But when they die, they all come together. Everybody's in one group up here. It's a heavenly thing. But you're right that they try to take this heavenly, saying, "Oh, well, we need to make that happen now." And you go, "Hey, this is happening. This isn't something that we're doing. This is something that God is doing, and this is how do they get there? By death." So, jeez. So I guess we can. Yeah. Anyways, all right. Well, let's pray. Now, Father, we do thank you again for the riches of the clarity that we have. takes some work to get to the details here, but thank you for what we see. It's exciting to know that we're not left. We are at the end of the age, and the signs are very, very clear. And every day that happens, we're getting even closer. So we know that the rapture is next on the horizon, and that's exciting. It could happen at any moment. May we be ready for that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.